Azure AD, PowerShell. In this video, I want to put those two things together. So I'm a huge fan of Azure Active Directory and PowerShell. And I was trying to kind of get a good grasp on what is the right method today to interact with Azure AD from PowerShell. And as I was starting to dig into it, it's actually a fairly confusing message. So I wanted to try and clear things up. Firstly, let's take a step back. So when I think about Azure Active Directory, there's the Azure AD Graph. This is the endpoint I can connect to for Azure AD management. Or rather, it was. It's still there, but it's not the preferred option anymore. Things are migrating towards the Microsoft Graph. Now, whereas the Azure AD Graph, as the name kind of says, is geared towards Azure Active Directory, the Microsoft Graph is Office 365, Dynamics, Windows 10 services, and Azure AD. And this is where all of the investment is going. So that's how, from an endpoint and API perspective, I can interact with Azure Active Directory. Now, PowerShell. So with PowerShell, there's Windows PowerShell. That's kind of the PowerShell we all know and love. It's been in Windows a long time. It was Monad. It's built on the .NET framework. And when we say Windows PowerShell, we also hear it talked about as the desktop version. So it's the version that's native to Windows. But like many things, cross-platform is a big driver today. And so there's also this thing called PowerShell Core. Now that is built on .NET Core. So .NET Core was originally created for things like Windows Core. It was a deployment of Windows that was kind of a subset of the operating system. We had the server core version, but also now for things like Linux. So .NET Core is cross-platform. And so PowerShell Core is also cross-platform. And once again, this is where all the investment is. So right now we're sort of basically waiting for PowerShell 7, which is built on PowerShell Core. It's in kind of the final release candidate as we speak. By the time you watch this, PowerShell 7 might be out, which is kind of that unification of naming, but it still is that cross-platform version. So we have kind of two different ways to interact with Azure Active Directory, different kind of RESTful APIs I can use, different endpoints, and two different versions of PowerShell. And I kind of think I want to be kind of that direction in terms of Azure AD and that direction in terms of PowerShell. Now there's also a thing called the MS Online. That was kind of the original thing we had way back. It was about Exchange Online management, and I could interact with Azure AD. I'm not covering that. That again is kind of in the past. So I think about where we are right now. I'm going to kind of draw a line between the PowerShell Core and the desktop, so core and desktop. We have the Azure AD Module. This is in general availability. It's very full-functioned. It's based on Windows PowerShell. So I cannot run this on PowerShell Core. So I can do it on PowerShell 5 that comes with Windows, great. But I cannot run it cross-platform. I cannot run it in the Cloud Shell that's part of Azure. So very full-featured, but it uses the Azure AD Graph. If you log in, when I do a connect Azure AD, it brings up a browser window and I type in my credential. That's kind of the authentication experience, and I'm authenticating for that session. Now there is also an Azure AD Preview module, which is basically the same. It's just giving me a look ahead at what's coming. So once again, that's talking to the Azure AD Graph. And once again, it's only Windows PowerShell. So it's the desktop version. It's not cross-platform. So really think about today, the Azure AD module. That's the one a lot of people are using. Great. It works. It's very full-featured. But it's only Windows PowerShell. And it's kind of using this Azure AD Graph that is going to go away a long time down the road. Then we have this Azure AD standard preview thing, and it's mostly hidden. But if you go to your Azure Cloud Shell, you'll notice you can interact with Azure AD. How? This thing. So this is actually built against the Microsoft Graph, and it runs on PowerShell core. So that's how we can interact with Azure Active Directory from the Cloud Shell. But it's mostly kind of hidden. It's not really a generally available thing. There is a version you can kind of download from the preview library, but I'm not really suggesting you go and start playing with that. This is the future. So there is a Microsoft.graph module, and I say module, it's really a meta module. As I'll show you later on when we demo these things, this is made up of lots of different modules. One's around users, groups. I can interact with my mailbox. I can interact with dynamics. So this is really exposing the full set of capabilities of the Microsoft Graph. It actually uses a technology that interacts with the API and then generates the modules that this exposes. So when I work with Azure AD, it's all MG. So get-mg user. That's how I can interact with it. Now this is in preview right now. This is early days, but this, when I think about Azure Active Directory, all of the capabilities that the graph exposes, this is the module, Microsoft.graph. So all of the advanced things I want to do, everything I can do with the Azure AD module today, we're going to see this in the Microsoft.graph. That's the module when I think about deep Azure Active Directory integration and performing really any action. There's another option. So there's also the Azure Resource Manager endpoint. Now you might say, well, what's that got to do with Azure AD? I create virtual machines and storage accounts. But if you look at the AZ, again, that's a meta module. There's an az.resources. And within that, there are actually some commandlets around users, groups. So think about this module. This module exposes everything about Azure Active Directory, every little knob and dial that I want to change. But for most of us, there's maybe a core set of objects, users, groups, apps we want to interact with. The majority of the things we do. So the az.resources module from AZ exposes those things. So I can actually do sort of user group manipulations actually via the ARM endpoint using the az.resources. These two are the future. That's where the investment is. And this also, like Microsoft.graph, uses an auto kind of REST parser to create the content of those modules. So today, if you're using Azure AD, fantastic, carry on using it. If it works for you, great. But realize I can't use that thing on core and it is using this old Azure AD Graph. This is the future direction. You'll see a different authentication experience. When I do a connect Azure AD or connect graph here, this actually says, hey, go to the device logon browser and type in this code. Because maybe I'm on a machine that can't bring me up a browser to authenticate and do MFA. So these are built around that newer model where I can kind of authenticate from something else. And with Graph, when I connect, I actually have to tell it what I want to do. So the token I get has certain permissions that by default I can do hardly anything. I can read a few things. I tell it what types of resource I want to interact with. So if you're starting today and you look into, well, what's the best way to interact for bulk, fairly standard operations on Azure AD, I can absolutely use the ad.resources. I can do a lot of things from there. If I need all of those knobs and dials, I'd be looking at the Microsoft.graph. Both of these are really hooking into the modern kind of Microsoft.graph, this via ARM for the AZ module. And these all work on both PowerShell Core and Windows PowerShell, so desktop and the Core edition. So let's take a quick look at these things. So for the demonstrations, I'm going to use the Windows Terminal application. This is awesome in that I can easily have multiple different terminals open. So right now I have a Windows PowerShell open and a PowerShell Core. So remember, the Windows PowerShell is that desktop version. If I look at the PS version table, I'll see my edition is desktop compared to my PowerShell Core, which is built on the .NET Core. I'll see that edition is core. And you can always check what a module is compatible with. If I do a get module list available, it will actually show me is the compatibility core, desktop, or just desktop. So you can see all these different ones available. I've got installed here. See, I've got the Microsoft Graph, core and desktop. You can see I've got my AZ core and desktop. And they're the ones we're really going to focus on today. But we'll start with the more traditional, the Azure AD module. And as you can see, its edition is desktop, i.e. it's not going to run in my PowerShell core. So I'm going to jump over to Windows PowerShell. And from here, I would just do my connect to Azure AD. And what that's going to do is an interactive connection. So that seems to just be hanging. So I'm going to actually just try and run it from Windows PowerShell. So once again, we'll do the Azure AD connect Azure AD. That's working. Something about that Windows terminal, it's still in preview. But you notice it prompts me via kind of an interactive experience. Here I could enter the account that I want to sign in with. Password as usual. If there was MFA. And now I'm connected. And from here, I can run the various commands. I can look at my Azure AD users. And I can look at all of the different commands that are available. So if I do command module Azure AD, there's a huge number of commands available. So this is very full featured. Again, it's in general release. It's using the Azure AD Graph, but it only runs in Windows PowerShell. There's obviously the Azure AD Preview as well. From here, if I was to do find module, this is going to go and browse. If I do Azure AD Preview, this is checking the online repositories that I have registered with this PowerShell environment. And I can see, well, yep, there's the preview version. So I can install that. I have to have the Azure AD or the Azure AD Preview. So that's available as well. If I was to go to a browser, so if I open up my Cloud Shell and I want the PowerShell option, it automatically has that Azure AD.standard.preview. If I do my get module list available, let's make this a bit bigger. What we'll actually see is, there we go, that Azure AD.standard.preview. Now, the fact this is desktop, don't let this concern you. It is running on core. If I was to look at the PS version table, this is actually a Linux container. Here I can see it's core and it's actually running Linux. So I have to connect, but I already have kind of a refresh token within the Cloud Shell. So although I'm doing connect Azure AD, because it's using Microsoft Graph, I don't actually get prompted to do anything. I'm just connected. Now I could run the various commands and I get the information. And once again, there's a lot of functionality here. But this is really limited to the Cloud Shell. There is ways to get this. There are private repositories. But this is what I have just instantly available in the Cloud Shell to interact with Azure Active Directory. So now let's think about what is that future direction. And we have the two. And I'm going to jump back over. That's still sitting there. That's obviously very confused because it's trying to open up a browser when it can't. So we have the Microsoft Graph and we have the AZ. So I'll start with AZ. So from here, if I do get command and we look at the az.resources module, and I'll just focus on anything that's AZAD. And from here, I can see there's a whole bunch of different commands. I can do things like get AD user. And there I've got that information. And I can do a lot of things from here. For example, if I do get help, new AD user, and look at examples, I can see, yep, I can create users with credential objects to get the password. And there really is a lot I can do here. If you think about the majority of the types of actions I want to do around Azure AD, well, those are kind of covered here. If I look at the unique nouns, well, I can deal with applications, groups, group memberships, service principal credentials, users, and of course, app credentials. So that covers a pretty wide use of things that I might want to do. Then we get to Microsoft Graph. Now this is, once again, using the Microsoft Graph endpoint, as the name would suggest. I've already installed it, but you could do a find module, Microsoft.graph, and then you would do an install module Microsoft.graph and then import it in. Now this is preview right now. But what we can do is let's take a look. So this is a meta module. So when I've installed this, what it actually does, so I've not actually imported this yet. So what I actually do, cracking up, is if I add list available, now I can see them all. So look at all these different modules. I can see ones around users, groups, teams, sites, places, meetings, identity, groups, education, device apps, analytics. So it's a full gambit of different things. And what's interesting with this is, just like the AZ, if you've ever used AZ, I don't actually have to go to a prompted browser. It will tell me to, hey, open a browser, it could be on a different machine, type in this device code to authenticate. Well, that's the same experience here. If I do connect graph, it will guide me through that process. It will say, hey, look, open a browser. This could be on a completely different machine, or in this case, sure, I can do it on the same one. And what I have to do is I copy in this code. Now you might say, this is very inconvenient. But what this is doing behind the scenes is now it's actually giving this machine a refresh token that if I use this within 30 days will be persisted even between closing and reopening. So I've got this. So now I can do, well, get MG user. So all of the Microsoft Graph have MG. So it's get Microsoft Graph user. And there's my users. Now this worked because I already previously did a connection and got a token. What I actually had to do to get all the privileges was tell it, well, what scopes do I want? So what I actually ran with was this. And what I had to do would be to consent to those permissions. That's what lets me do all of these things. And I can interact with other services as well. For example, I could go and check the mailbox. And I could search for a certain subject. So I'm searching for PIM digest in the subject of my mail items. And it can find me those things as well. If we think about the commands I have available, this is very, very rich. You saw all the different modules I had. I can pretty much expose the entire scope of functionality of the Microsoft Graph. You can see all the different types of commands I have. And I can really do anything through this. So if I think about the most full-featured future direction, well, that's going to be the Microsoft.graph. It works on core and desktop. It's using the Microsoft Graph. I get that great refresh token. So even if I close this, if I was to reopen it, I can do my get AZ AD user. So that refresh token for my AZ connection, that's still there. If I do my get MG user, you'll notice it's complaining, but if I do connect graph, I'm just connected through. It has the refresh token, it's just going to use it. Now I can do my get MG user. So yes, I have to go and open up the browser and type in that code one time, but that refresh token, as long as I use this within 30 days, will be kept. And as soon as I use it again, I get another 30 days. It's a sliding window. So both AZ and this Microsoft.graph module use the new authentication option. And they're what I want to think about. If I'm doing these bulk kind of standard actions, sure, I can use the az.resources module. For the fullest feature, I'm going to use Microsoft.graph, and it's only going to get better. It's still early days, but that's where all the investment is going. The Microsoft.graph endpoint and the Microsoft.graph and the AZ PowerShell modules. If you're using the Azure AD module today on Windows PowerShell and it's working for you, great. Just realize as you start doing new work, you might want to start transitioning over. I hope that was useful. I hope you can now see how I can put my Azure AD and PowerShell together. If this was good, please give this a like and subscribe, and I'll see you on another video soon. Take care.